Hello, my name is TJ Walker, and welcome to this episode of Renew. Renew is a show about the College of Forest Resources at Mississippi State University. The College of Forest Resources works to promote and enable the conservation, management, and sustainable use of our forest and natural resources to benefit our state, our nation, and the world. We have 3 departments in the College of Forest Resources, and today we're going to learn a little bit more about the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. Representing the Department of WFA is Luke Resup. How you doing, sir?
Good. How are you?
All right.
Glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit more about yourself and how did you find your way to Mississippi State?
Well, I'm originally a Pennsylvania boy, so I grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and we lived on 16 acres, so kind of out in the woods, and I've just always enjoyed being outside and learning and exploring. I did my undergrad at Virginia Tech in wildlife conservation.
Okay.
And at the time, I thought I wanted to be a game warden. And I didn't honestly know that there was more to the wildlife field than being a game warden. But once I got into the wildlife program there, I learned that there's a plethora of different career avenues for someone to go down once they get into wildlife. So once I was at Virginia Tech, I really became interested in white-tailed deer management, specifically habitat management. Between my junior and senior year at Virginia Tech, I got a technician job down here at Mississippi State. I thought this is where I wanted to go to grad school. I knew I wanted to go get my master's degree. So I came down here to try to get my foot in the door at Mississippi State, get to know the professors, get to know the guys who run the MSU Deer Lab. And then a couple years later, fast forward, a position came open, and here I am. I've been here for the last 3.5 years.
Okay. So you are a graduate student. So are you master's, PhD? What level are you?
I'm PhD now. I just finished my master's. Okay. I guess in June I officially finished it. So I did my master's here, and now I'm working on my PhD.
Well, congrats on being at that stage.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the MSU Deer Lab. So what is the Deer Lab, and what do you do in the Deer Lab?
So the Deer Lab is directed by my bosses, Dr. Steve Damaris and Dr. Bronson Strickland. They co-direct the Deer Lab. And the Deer Lab, very simply, we focus on applied deer management and applied deer research. So we do a lot of scientific research projects, and those research projects are designed to answer questions that are very relevant to hunters, to land managers, to state agencies, to federal agencies who are tasked with managing deer habitat, whatever the case may be.
Nice. So I hear that white-tailed deer hunting is big business, especially in Mississippi. Any idea how much that business contributes to our economy?
Yeah, so the numbers that I've seen on this are a few years old, but I think it's very reasonable to assume that those numbers are as much, if not more, especially when you account for inflation and everything. But about $1 billion every year white-tailed deer hunting brings into our state. So, that's everything from food plot seed to, all the gear that hunters use and the time they spend here and all that kind of stuff. So nice. It's a big deal. And it's especially a big deal for me. I spend probably more money on it than my wife would like sometimes, but it's a passion for sure.
Okay, so since we know it's big business in our state and many of us enjoy the sport of deer hunting, do we need to keep track of our deer and their behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely, we do. It's very important for not only for hunters and the curiosity they have for the game that they're pursuing, and they want to know their habits and their home range size and when they move and why they move, just because they like to hunt them and they like to understand them better. But at a probably deeper level, it's really important for the state agency, for MDWF&P, our wildlife agency, to have the information that we help generate in the Deer Lab, because we can provide some hard numbers and help them answer the questions they need to make management decisions, whether that's for CWD regulations or management zones or setting targets for harvest quotas, whatever the case may be.
So with keeping track of them, how do we know if they're sedentary or if they migrate? Is there a specific practice that's used to keep track of them?
Yeah, so thankfully those technologies have come a long way in the last few decades. We used to put a radio collar on deer and it would emit this VHF signal, just like a radio signal. And biologists would walk around in the woods or in the back of the truck with an antenna and have to triangulate those points. Now we put a very similar collar on them, but it's a GPS collar, and you can set that thing to take a location fix every 5 minutes if you wanted to, every 2 hours, whatever. So now we capture the deer, put a GPS collar on them, and turn them back out into wherever we captured them from, and we can literally track those deer over the course of a year, 2 years, however long.
Okay. So it's safe to say that some move and some don't?
Well, they certainly all move, but some move a lot more than others do. So some of the research that we've done here at the Deer Lab over the last 6, 7, 8 years, and I kind of came in at the tail end of this project, but my predecessors, Colby and Ashley, they were graduate students here, and they worked on a project in the Big Black River region of Mississippi. And there were a lot of different objectives of that project, but one of the things we learned kind of by happenstance, we weren't trying to document these, what we've since termed mobile and sedentary deer, but one of the things we learned is that some deer have essentially a migratory personality. And that's if you go up to more northern states like Michigan and some of the, where they get a lot of snowfall and they have really harsh winters, it's more common for deer to what we call a yard, go to a deer yard. So they'll have kind of their summer range and then they'll move to a winter range where there's, where there's better thermal cover, maybe more foraging opportunities, easier movement through snow, those kind of things. But when we typically think of a migratory deer, they're usually migrating to avoid really severe winter weather. Well, we don't have that here in Mississippi. We don't have that really severe winter weather. So when we started documenting, some of these deer moving 13, 18 miles between these kind of disjunct home ranges, biologically, it's kind of a strange phenomenon because we don't have the typical drivers of migration here that, deer herds in northern environments experience. But in general, about 1/3 of the adult bucks that we monitor have what we've termed a migratory or a mobile personality, and they'll move between separate home ranges, sometimes multiple times throughout the year, sometimes just once. And then the other 2/3 have a sedentary personality. Gotcha. And it's not to say those deer don't move, they certainly do, but they just have more of a typical home range pattern that we would expect to see in a southern deer population.
Gotcha. So you mentioned migratory bucks. And so do you only track bucks or do you track does?
Well, most of the projects we've done over the last 5 years, at least the big one in the Big Black River, we focused exclusively on adult bucks. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we have done another project or two where we've collared adult bucks and adult does. And we've seen the same kind of patterns with does as we have with bucks. We don't have as much data on them to say if it's 1/3 versus 2/3 sedentary mobile. But actually the deer that we've collared that moved the farthest was a doe in the Mississippi Delta. She moved about 35 miles from where we captured her in the fall. And then when the floodwaters came in, late winter, spring, when it gets really wet in the Delta, she moved 35 miles and almost left the Delta.
Wow.
So certainly bucks and does do it.
Nice. Okay. So you've been doing research for quite a while. Are there any unanswered questions that you hope to address in your own research?
Well, certainly for the work I'm working on now for my PhD, I'm not working on deer movement right now, but it's more of a habitat-focused project looking at food plots and the impact of regenerative agriculture, specifically applied to wildlife food plots, versus some of our conventional techniques. So our conventional techniques that we've used, they're very tried and true. We've been using them for decades. In terms of managing deer habitat and specifically food plots. Rely heavily on tillage, rely heavily on herbicides and fertilizer, a lot of synthetic inputs. And there's been a movement in the last few decades in the ag world, specifically row crop agriculture, and some of the livestock world, moving to more of a regenerative or holistic approach, where you're kind of removing some of those synthetic inputs just because of the, just because of the negative impacts they can have on water quality, soil health, those things. So my PhD is kind of looking at that in a wildlife perspective.
I understand. So we have students and parents watching, and some of these students may have never considered a career in wildlife or heard about careers in wildlife. What would your message be to prospective students if they're hearing this message and they're interested now in a career in potentially wildlife?
Yeah, I would say that there are lots of options, and I would suggest they find a local biologist or somebody who has a career in wildlife and just sit down and have a conversation. You can look up on your state game agency's website, type in MDWF&P or whatever state you're living in, and find a local biologist, give them a call, email them, and just ask, kind of how they got to where they are, what they do for a living. Ask if you could go ride along for a day and kind of see what they do. And I just talked to somebody because there's so many different avenues. You can go a research route, you can go a state agency management route, you can go a private route. I mean, there's federal, all sorts of things you can do.
Gotcha. Okay, so deer season is here now, right?
It is.
So how should we properly prepare for the season?
I would say just get out there in the woods. I mean, just get out there and enjoy it, because we've been having beautiful weather lately. Take your thermocell with you. Mosquitoes will drag you away. But get out there, enjoy it, do your scouting, and have fun.
Okay, final question.
Okay.
Understand you have a social media presence. So how can people follow what's going on with the Deer Lab?
Yeah, so we are quite active on social media. We've got a Facebook page. We've got an Instagram page. We're trying to be more involved in our YouTube program, getting a lot of videos out there, and we've also got a podcast. So on Facebook and Instagram, just look up MSU Deer Lab. It'll come up. Our podcast, Deer University Podcast, you can just type it into Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. It's on there. And then YouTube is MSU Deer Lab TV. And the crux of all of that is we try to take the science that we do here from at a university level, and we try to boil everything down and make it very digestible for the average hunter, for the average land manager, and whoever. So we just try to make engaging content that's interesting from their perspective as they're out in the woods, observing deer, planting food plots, lighting prescribed fires, whatever the case may be.
Gotcha. So Luke, when you finish your PhD, what's next?
I don't know yet. I mean, that's still probably 10 years away, and I can't think that far into the future, so I'm just here trying to enjoy it while I'm here.
Understand. Well, it has definitely been a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about your journey, learning more about what you're doing in our Deer Lab, and just to know what actually happens in our Deer Lab. And so this information that you've shared will definitely be beneficial to our prospective students and their parents as they're watching our show. We thank y'all for joining us on this episode of Renew, and we'll see you next time.